my dive is good, but I can't see it because I'm hurling in midair and everything's a blur. And so I have to rely on my coach to tell me if it was any good. I feel like creative work is the same way. You're too close to it to know how the audience is going to react to it. And yes, you don't want to create it just for the audience, but at the end of the day, you want it to be, interesting or useful to them. So I asked for the 0 to 10, and no one ever says 10. And then I use that as a calibration mechanism. So if everybody is in the 7 or 8 range, I know that I'm onto something promising, and now I need to refine it. If I get a bunch of 2s, 3s, 3.5s, I either need to rethink the idea or dramatically rewrite how I'm positioning it. And I think one of the mistakes a lot of people make is they know they need feedback on their ideas. They go to 1 or 2 people and they start to feel a little bit defensive or threatened, and their ego gets involved, and then they don't ask for any more. What they don't realize is it's actually less painful if you get more feedback. Because when 8 different people critique your work, you start to realize that a few of the comments that sort of bruise you a little bit were just idiosyncratic, and no one else cared about those issues. But then 5 people had the same problem. You're like, that is not taste, that is a quality issue, and I've got to focus on that. And so it really helps to filter what are the revisions I need to make, what are the problems and complaints I need to pay attention to, versus what can I ignore because maybe this product was not for that person.
I'm recalling when I was a postdoc, I had a manuscript fully prepared, and I worked in a laboratory where I didn't work on the same thing as my postdoc advisor. He was very gracious in letting me be the outlier. And he said, well, I don't know anything about this topic, so before you submit it to this fairly prestigious, very frankly, very prestigious journal, I'll be honest, you should probably go down the hall and hand it to so-and-so. I don't want to mention who it was because I'm still in the same department. And I gave it to him, this individual, and he looked at it and he said, yeah, it looks interesting, but I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of interest in this. It's just like not. I was like, no way, like this, I think this is really cool. But I was pretty dismayed. So I was like, oh gosh, so what do I do? So I went back to my advisor, and thankfully, he's a bit of an iconoclast, and he said, that's the best feedback you could have gotten. Definitely submit it to that particular journal. And I must say, that paper got accepted faster than any other paper. I've never had an experience like that. I mean, it required some revisions. I remember thinking like, wow, what an unusual response to after having instructed me to go ask a more senior colleague, right? He was at that time, assistant professor, and then to get the essentially negative response, and then to take that as like, you should definitely send it out. It really taught me a lesson that sometimes one needs to invert their action according to the negative feedback they get. Not always, but that was an N of 1. Okay, so it's not shouldn't be extrapolated to too many circumstances, but basically led me to not seek out feedback prior to submission of things terribly often. I mean, I check information obviously prior to podcasts. I check the validity of the information in podcasts and papers, but it made me realize that people's opinions can be like highly idiosyncratic and in some cases outright wrong. And really the opinion of the journal is what mattered most in terms of getting it accepted or not. So how do you said give it to the greatest number of people. But if it's anything like comments on social media, there's a salience to negative comments. So how should we filter positive versus negative feedback?
Well, there's a meta-analysis here. This is Kluger and Denisi looking at 100 years of feedback research. And they found that what drives the utility of feedback is not whether it's positive or negative. It's whether it focuses on the task or on the self. So if I tell you that your work is terrible, you're going to get defensive. If I tell you that your work is great, you're going to get complacent. If I tell you, here's the specific thing that I liked about your work, you're going to try to learn to repeat that. And if I tell you, here's the thing I didn't like, you're going to try to see if you can fix it. So I actually think we should worry less about whether the feedback is encouraging or discouraging, and more about how do I make sure that I get input that's going to allow me to learn from my strengths and also overcome my weaknesses. And actually, one of the things I've learned recently is there's some, I would say, a growing body of evidence at this point that asking for feedback is not the best way to get people to help you. Because when you ask for feedback, you end up getting 2 groups of people. You get cheerleaders and you get critics. And cheerleaders are basically applauding your best self. Critics are attacking your worst self. What you want is a coach, which is somebody who helps you become a better version of yourself. And the way you get people to coach you is not to say, give me feedback, because they will then look at the past and tell you what you screwed up or what you did right. What you want is to say, can you give me advice for next time? And then they look at the future and they'll give you either a note on something to repeat or something to correct. And this is such a subtle shift, but it can make a big difference. Andrew, one of the things I found myself applying this to a lot is after giving speeches. I used to get off stage and say, I would love some feedback. And you get back a bunch of, oh, I really enjoyed that. Thanks. What do I do with that information? I'm trying to learn how to get better. And when I shift the question to say, what's the one thing I could do better next time? It's like, oh, don't open with a joke. The audience couldn't tell you were joking. Frequently, it's give me a little bit more of a through line. You focused a lot on a bunch of interesting points, but I lost the connective tissue. And those actionable suggestions are much more likely to come when you just ask for a tip as opposed to an evaluation.
Oh, that's so good. I'm going to just pause for a second. I've never taken a pause. I've taken an occasional pause, to be honest, but they're very rare, as the audience knows. Oh, that's just gazillion-dollar advice, because I think that everyone has an ego. We all want to perform well. We'd like to perform better over time, and negative feedback hurts. And it can hurt a little or a lot depending on how defensive we are, but a tool like you just described to remove some of that defensive armor that we all have and actually let the information in a way that's constructive is really great. What you described, I think, is a way to create constructive criticism, but the constructive part is really coming from within, as opposed to saying, I'd like some constructive criticism and then hoping that the criticism is actually constructive. So you're taking control over the process in a healthy way, in a benevolent way.
That's the goal. And I think the big question that comes up for a lot of people at this point is, okay, so I get somebody to give me advice, but it might still sting. How do I get better at taking it constructively? And I think probably my favorite technique on this I learned from Sheila Heen. She calls it the second score. And the idea is that when somebody gives you a piece of criticism, that's your first score. So let's say, in my world, they gave me a 3.5, and I want to know how I can do better next time. How do I get myself to focus on that? What I do is say, I want to get a 10 for how well I took the 3.5. And that's the second score. I want to evaluate myself on how well I took the first score. I think about this almost every day. There was, can I tell you a quick story? Please. So when I was right out of my doctorate, I got asked to teach a motivation class for Air Force generals and colonels. I was 25, I think, 25, 26. They're all twice my age. They've got thousands of flying hours. They've got billion-dollar budgets. They've got, well, this community well. Their nicknames are Striker and Sand Dune. And I was extremely intimidated. So I walked in there and I thought I had to impress them. And I started talking about my credentials and all my research experience. And the feedback at the end of the 4-hour session was brutal. I remember reading the feedback forms, and one person had written, more knowledge in the audience than on the podium. I was like, true. I can't argue with that. And then another wrote, I gained nothing from this session, but I trust the instructor gained useful insight. And that was devastating. I was like, I would really like to transform into an actual bear and hibernate for the next 4 months, and then maybe I'll come out of a hole ready to hear this. I didn't have that option. I had committed to teach a second session a week later. So all I could do was figure out, how am I going to hear this feedback and really take it seriously? And I guess I applied a version of the second score, and I said, all right, there's some generals that are going to come back and see me again, and I've got to prove to them that I was open to feedback. And one of the things I heard loud and clear was that they valued humility, and I had led with too much confidence, which was just insecurity masked. And so I thought, okay, how do I change the equation? And walked in, looked at the room, and I said, I know what you're all thinking right now. What could I possibly learn from a professor who's 12 years old? Dead silence. I'm like, oh no, this is going to go horribly wrong. And then one of the guys in the audience jumps in and he's like, oh, that's ridiculous. You got to be at least 13. Everybody started laughing. It broke the ice. And I think what I was trying to do was to take myself off the pedestal and say, look, I heard your feedback. You told me that you didn't think I had anything to teach you, and I've got to acknowledge that right up front and be open to the fact that that's true. And so I want to come in here and learn from you, and I want to see if I can curate a conversation where we all end up learning. And the feedback was night and day different. Afterward, one person wrote, although junior in experience, the professor dealt with the evidence in an interesting way. I was like, all right, I'll take it. And there's something really powerful about saying, look, I can't change the fact that they hated my session. What I can do is convince them that I was motivated to learn from their criticism.
I love this concept of the second score, and thank you for sharing that story. I think, very often we hear about people like you who, if people didn't catch the math in there, you were a PhD by age 25. And as far as I know, the youngest tenured professor at Penn at 28. So these are outrageously impressive metrics of accomplishment. But for you to share a story about less than optimal performance and how you adjusted to it, and the incorporation of the second score that you're referring to, I think is really appreciated, because I think that as much as we hear, Jordan, took many more, free throws, and everyone just thinks about all the ones he made. People think about all the ones he made. That's the way the game works. That's the way the mind works, I should say. So it's I appreciate that you've fleshed it out with a personal example. I too would want to turn into a bear and disappear, but I think that it's really impressive what you did, and it makes me think that the second score of getting a 10 at bringing the 3.5 up, right, as it were, is really about turning a score into a verb process. Over and over again, as I do this podcast and as I've taught in the classroom, what I keep coming back to is this idea that we should be focusing more on verbs and less on nouns. We love to name things and categorize them, but when we start living life through a lot of verb processes, so instead of being fit, and we think about or running as a thing, we really think about like just running, right? It becomes less daunting, and we accomplish far more. But the idea that, and there are mathematical models of this, I'm sure, but where you're basically talking about, like an integral, right? As opposed to just some value, right? You're talking about the slope of the line, right? So you're a 3.5, how are you going to get to a 10? Gosh, that's a huge gap. And you're dealing with being back on your heels psychologically from getting all this, battering feedback from these, these highly accomplished individuals, all these accoutrements, and literally wearing them presumably on their body, for you to see. And it's really about it's about taking control of the slope of that line from the 3 onward, and it's really a forward-looking perspective. So I don't think we're being unduly psychological here or analytic. I mean, I think it's really about taking a moment state and a noun and turning it into a verb.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm reminded of the great philosopher Homer Simpson, who said that verbing weirds language. So it's harder to talk about this stuff in verbs.
I swear I didn't steal it from The Simpsons, but if it came from Homer Simpson, I'm all for it.
You have to. I mean, that's
small brain,
credible.
Small brain, but given the size of his brain, and people have seen the image, fairly robust knowledge.
No, I think you're onto something. I think verbs are active, and we're drawn to them. I think. Yeah, a lot of times people review their past work and they end up shaming an earlier version of themselves, and they wallow in rumination. And what we want to try to do in that situation, which is easier said than done, is to say, all right, like the purpose of getting feedback or advice is not to shame my past self, it's to educate my future self. Which I think is very connected to a lot of the work on growth mindset that you've been talking about. And there's been a firestorm of controversy around can we teach growth mindset in schools lately? And I think what that has underscored for me is, look, you can't expect someone to listen to one podcast episode or go through one workshop and magically believe that they're capable of learning anything at any moment. This is something we have to actively work on a daily basis. And part of doing that, exactly as you said, is thinking about the slope and saying, all right, the person that I'm competing with is my past self, and I want to get a little bit better today than I was yesterday.
Yeah, I think along the lines of growth mindset, obviously we both know Carol Dweck, and respect her tremendously. And I realize there is some controversy now around how readily one can teach growth mindset or incorporate growth mindset. My understanding, and I'd love to know your thoughts on this, is that when the Dweck work is combined with some of the Ali Crum work, that is, growth mindset is combined with a knowledge, just a basic and true understanding that stress and the feelings of anxiety and tension that can actually be performance enhancing. When those two things are combined, I think this is the work of David Yeager and colleagues at UT Austin, that indeed growth mindset becomes more visible in our mindsets and performance. And are there other aspects to growth mindset and other mindsets that are now being woven into that framework that can be helpful? Because I know, if ever there was a great name for a area of psychology, growth mindset, it tells you everything you want, everything you need, and everything you sort of need to know in just the name. But we all find it difficult to implement. Just telling myself I'm not as good as something as I could be yet, it sounds great, but in moments of receiving feedback that's harsh, sometimes it's hard to access.
Yeah, it is. I think so. The latest, there's a McNamara et al. Meta-analysis, and then I think sort of that camp versus the Carol and David camp, have very different views on how big the effects are. But I think one thing they seem to agree on is growth mindset is more important in circumstances where people are more likely to need it. So if you think about, for example, kids who are impoverished or marginalized communities, the message that you actually, that you are capable of evolving your skills to the point that something you're bad at today, you could be good at next year, is really important when you've never heard that before. And when you don't have a single person believing in you. I think where we're often missing the boat is we think, all right, I'm gonna instill this idea in a person's head and my work is done. And we know that the context around you really matters. So actually Carol's done some research showing that growth mindset is more likely to have an impact when your classroom culture also, and your teacher, right, has the belief that kids are capable of learning and growing, that your starting ability is not fixed in any subject. And I think we probably, for all of us as individuals, what that means is we need to think about the micro environment that we put ourselves in. I think I guess one of the things I've been thinking a lot about lately is scaffolding. And the idea that when you're trying to improve at something, you don't need a permanent teacher necessarily. You don't need one mentor, guiding you for 9 years. What you need is somebody who can give you the temporary support that allows you to scale to a new height, just like a scaffold would on a building. And in learning theory, basically the idea behind scaffolding is we're going to initially give you the support you need to solve a problem, and then we're going to slowly remove the support so that you learn to do it on your own. And I think that those kinds of scaffolds are often missing. So we instill the growth mindset, like I've got this belief in my head, but I don't know what I need to do to put that belief into action. And that's where that to me is, we have to go beyond mindset. We have to think about how do we put people in a context that allows them to put their beliefs into practice. You were asking me what else do we need to support growth mindset and make it effective, right?
Yeah, we know people learn what growth mindset is. It's the idea that you're not as good at something yet. Okay, terrific, but it's very hard to implement in real time. There are, I have to presume, additional tools that one can bolster the growth mindset with, make it more accessible and benefit from it.
Yes. So Justin Berg and Amy Resneski and I studied this actually. We were looking at growth mindset at work, and Justin's. He's at Stanford. I don't know if you met him yet.
I have not, but big place.
Yes,
but
I figured as much.
He'll be on the list soon. If
brilliant creativity researcher, and Amy just joined us at Wharton and has fundamentally changed the way that I think about ideas, in the way that she studied how we can shape our context and just done path-breaking work there. And we were interested in growth mindset, and we designed an intervention where people could learn growth mindset at work. So we taught them to think about how their skills were malleable, how they could stretch their knowledge into new areas. And we found that teaching them that was not enough to boost their happiness or their performance. What we needed to also do was give them a growth mindset, not just about themselves, but also about their jobs. In other words, to teach them that your job is a set of flexible building blocks, that you've got a whole bunch of tasks that make up your job. Some of those are things to do. Others might be interactions that you need to have. And if you break down your job into all these tasks, you might have some tasks that you want to accentuate and make a bigger part of your job. Others that you want to try to subtract. Others that you might swap with a colleague. And a lot of people, it turns out, think their jobs are fixed by their job descriptions, but in fact, you have a ton of opportunity to say, wait a minute, there's a strength I have, but I'm not using it right now. Is there a way we can bring that into my work? And so in these couple experiments we did, when we randomly assigned people to learn both that their jobs were malleable and that their skills were malleable, they got a sustainable boost to their happiness that lasted at least 6 months. There was no cost to their performance, meaning you could redesign your own job to be more enjoyable without a drop in the effectiveness of your contributions to your workplace. And I think what I came away from that research realizing is like it's not enough to just say, well, I can get better, I can improve. Because very often you feel like your environment is limited. I'm like, great, like, yeah, I can grow, but I'm stuck in a dead-end job. And so what we need to do there is open up the opportunity for people to innovate on their own job description, and then the growth mindset can begin to have an impact.
I love it. It sounds a bit like adding a S to growth mindset. So it's not growth mindset, it's growth mindsets. Because earlier you mentioned that in the classroom environment, if the teacher adopts a growth mindset,
yes,
as well as the students, well, then you have a culture of growth mindset. So it's the interconnectedness of this and the context in which the individual's growth mindset exists. Do I have that right?
Well put. Yeah, we ended up calling it dual mindset, but I think making it a plural is good because it's not. I have this image of you put a person in a cage and then tell them they're capable of growing. They're still stuck in a cage. And so we need to give them a chance to bust through those walls.
Super important. I hate to take us back to an earlier topic, but there's something that I meant to ask you that I didn't, and I'm absolutely needing to ask you, which is your recent work or recent-ish work. It was a few years back now, and you're so prolific that I have to call it a few years back. The relationship between intrinsic motivation and performance on other tasks.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the reason I asked this is several-fold. I did 2 episodes of the podcast on ADHD. And one of the things that I learned in talking to experts on ADHD, people with ADHD, as well as looking at some of the novel treatments, everything from behavioral to prescription drug to even nutrition-based, was that kids and adults with clinically diagnosed ADHD are actually terrific at paying attention to things that they really enjoy or that they're super interested in. So clearly they have the capacity. It's just that they have deficits, if you will, in attending to things that are less exciting to them, less intriguing to them. So if I recall correctly, you have a publication that explored the relationship between intrinsic motivation and performance in other stuff.
Yeah.
And one of the major conclusions was that having a deep, deep interest in one thing might not be the best condition for performing well at other less interesting tasks. Could you tell us about that study? What motivated you to carry out that study, and what some of the major takeaways were?
Yeah, definitely. You summarized it really well. I think the original impetus, so this was another project with Jihei Shin, and Jihei came to me wanting to study intrinsic motivation. And we were talking about what do we know about intrinsic motivation and what are the gaps in our knowledge? And one thing that has always bothered me is when psychologists study something that sounds positive and they only study the benefits of it. I'm like, there's no such thing as an unmitigated good, right? All sort of enjoyable experiences have costs. All unpleasant experiences can have benefits. We need to fill out this 2x2 of good thing, bad thing, good outcome, bad outcome. And so my challenge to her was, can you show me the dark side of intrinsic motivation? And she came back and she said, what if there's a cost of loving a task leading you to hate a task that you don't like even more than you did before? It's like, oh, that's an interesting idea. It tracks with the basic psychology of contrast effects, where if you eat something delicious, then your least favorite food tastes a little bit worse afterward. And so I said, let's study this. So she ended up getting data from people at work, and then we also designed an experiment. And sure enough, the more passionate you are on task 1, the more your performance suffers if task 2 is really boring. And I guess what this did for me is it made me think differently about task sequencing. I used to wake up in the morning and do my most interesting task first. And then the grading was hell. And what I do now is I start with a moderately interesting task. It's a little bit of a warm-up for me. And then I have an exciting one to look forward to. And if I do have a task that's boring but important, I think the performance is going to suffer less.
Interesting. I normally don't ask about morning routines and how one structures their day because it's highly individual.
I completely agree.
Yeah, and it depends on whether or not people have kids and their pets and what other. But I'll just share with you a brief anecdote. I have a friend who's a very accomplished musician and has been for several decades now, and he told me that he has a practice of after he gets off stage, and he's like stadium sellout level musician. Has been for a long time and shows no signs of stopping. Just incredible, but a very down-to-earth person. And he said one of the first things he does when he gets off stage is to go do some menial task. I thought there's no way that's true, but I've known his wife since college, and she verified that statement. I was like, what sorts of menial tasks you're talking about? He's like, oh, like cleaning up some of the cans and things that are there, maybe even cleaning a toilet at a venue. And I thought, no chance, but it turns out to be true. And I said, what's this about? Is this about humility? He said, well, maybe a little bit, but he said it actually makes it a lot easier for him to return home and deal with the kind of little things that just are out of scale with the experiences that he just had.
He's tapering in a way.
Okay.
I think.
Yeah. I first of all, I was so struck by the fact that he had created this process for himself so long ago. And he's also somebody who's, he's maintained, he's like been in the same marriage for an extremely long time. He was extremely happy in that, and his family. I mean, one of these people that seems to thrive in all domains of life. And I'm certain that he struggles in some domain of life because everybody does. But it sounded to me like a very unusual practice, but it seems to kind of relate to this, that, he has this thing that he loves doing, playing music and performing in particular, and he's just, 0.01% at doing that. But then just like bring himself back down to earth, because so much of life, and especially family life, is like dealing with the schmutz and the inconvenience of everyday life.
Yeah, it actually sounds like what he's doing is he's resetting his frame of reference to say, if I go right home, then the contrast between this high octane experience I'm having and sort of muddling through everyday life is going to be extreme. If I do something really small, then family time is going to seem a lot bigger. Yeah.
So I realize that I'm taking a bit of a leap from your study on intrinsic motivation and low performance in other domains. But, to me, cleaning a toilet is, it's boring for all the wrong reasons, right? As you said.
You do not want that to be an exciting task.
And listen, I mean, if I had to do it for a living, I would, right? And I would try and do it as well as possible. Right. So, well, I found that study to be particularly interesting because I think that these days we glorify high performance, even quote unquote peak performance, something we can talk about. And we forget that, yes, oftentimes people who are ultra high performers can afford to pay other people to do all the other stuff. But I have to say, in knowing some ultra high performers and in knowing some people in the billionaire bracket, there's a high incidence of mental health issues, frankly, and lack of satisfaction with life that maybe even comes from not having to do anything besides the things that you find most intrinsically rewarding. We all think that, if I could, I would spend all day doing the things that I find most intrinsically rewarding. But maybe there's something about this push-pull. We know the brain works in push-pull with almost everything, that having some experiences each day that are kind of like, this is a thing again. Do you think that heightens our level of satisfaction for the things we really enjoy?
I would be surprised if it didn't. Mm-hmm. I think contrast effects are very powerful, and we know. I mean, there's half a century of research on happiness suggesting that the comparisons we make are what matter. I think Tim Urban probably put it best when he said happiness is reality minus expectations. And if you only have enjoyable experiences, your expectations are rising into perpetuity. So it doesn't matter how good your reality is, you wanted it to be better and better. I think one of the things that mundane experiences manage to do for us, or maybe a better way to say it is, I think one of the benefits of mundane experiences is they keep our expectations on the ground and allow us to be pleasantly surprised by a task that was more interesting than we expected, even though we didn't love it.
What are your thoughts on what I call momentum, which is when I have an experience that I particularly like if we record a podcast and I'm really excited to get it out into the world, or if I have some experience that I'm left, very excited by at the end, that oftentimes the energy, again, I'm obsessed with this concept of neural energy, the energy that I glean from that experience seems to have carryover into other things.
Yeah.
I'm going to be much more excited to just go across the street and get a cup of coffee. Feels like a bigger thing than it normally would. And I would think that one could kind of ride the wake of a prior accomplishment, even a small accomplishment each day, and make the, tidying up or doing things that one would normally find more boring, less boring. Is that true? The way you're describing contrast effects makes it seem like it's more of a cliff. Like that thing was great and now this thing. But I also can kind of ride high on something that happened 2-3 days ago, maybe even 2-3 months ago. So feeling good equates to feeling good, or feeling good accentuates the bad stuff.
This is the tension between contrast and spillover. And you can see both under different conditions. I think this is a brand new sort of, I don't think anybody's reconciled those two perspectives yet, but my hunch from having worked on the contrast part of it is we found that it was only extreme intrinsic motivation that had the performance cost on other tasks. So if you're enjoying something, if you like it, that will give you a lift for other tasks. It's where this is the best thing you've ever done, and now other things suck by comparison. That's where we start to see you run into a problem. I also wonder if there's a domain switching effect here. I think you're alluding to this. I read some research that just came out this year showing that one of the surprising benefits of morning workouts is you actually have more confidence in your job because you get that small win. Like, I accomplished something this morning, and that gives you a sense of efficacy that you can carry over into the start of your workday. Not to suggest that everyone should work out in the morning, because I'm with you. I think everybody should both work and work out at a time that works for them. But I think there's something to be said for something went really well in one realm of my life, and that boosts my belief in my capability to tackle challenges in a different realm.
What about in the opposite direction? You were a competitive diver. I have to presume that there were days when you had lousy dives. It must have been that one day. Adam.
Felt like every day.
Right? And then you leave. You shower up, dry off, head into the rest of your day. And how do we segment away from the negative thought spirals of like something went really poorly, and now you're off into the domain of life where you can do, how to do the things that you're required to do, but maybe there's some challenge and some learning involved. How do we cut moats between negative experiences?
I think, the Ted Lasso strategy is ideal. Become a goldfish, 10-second memory, and then you don't even recall the practice you had earlier today. I think that I don't know anybody who can do that consistently. And I think the more disappointing the experience is, the more you tend to dwell on it. I think when you talk about segmenting negative experiences, I think probably the research that I've liked best on this, and I want to make sure I capture this clearly. So research on emotion regulation says there are two strategies that tend to be effective. One is distraction, the other is reframing. So distraction is, find something else that will consume your attention, that's unrelated to the thing that you just bombed at. And the hope is that, that fades into the background. Reframing is a lot of what you were talking about a few minutes ago, which is, okay, let me focus, not on the level of my performance, but the slope. My diving coach, Eric Best, has a really great set of questions that he asks. And, I remember I'd finish practice. I'm like, this is a terrible day. I just feel like I'm worthless as a diver, and now diving was a big part of my identity. I'm going to let my team down. Now I'm a bad teammate too. My coach is wasting his time, and like now, he could have been, training somebody much better. Like, why am I doing this? And Eric would ask, did you make yourself better today? And even if it was a bad practice, there is something that improved. Yes. Okay. And sometimes the answer feels like no. And then he would ask, did you make someone else better today? Like, yeah, I gave a little tip to a teammate. I made a joke that made everybody laugh. And he was like, great, then it wasn't a bad day. And I think this is an example of what good reframing looks like. To say, okay, the goal wasn't to be great, it was to be better. the goal wasn't necessarily just to make myself better. It was also to make other people better. And I think those are the kinds of questions that seem to segment pretty well.
I love that feedback because I think we all get stuck in those thought spirals. And again, not to demonize smartphones because they are wonderful tools, but I have to remember the time, I'm 48 years old as of tomorrow, and I have to remember a time in which negative stuff was probably happening in the background, but I didn't hear about it because no one was texting it to me. So I'd find out at the end of the day when I still had time to do other things in the meantime. Right. That said, I would also get negative experiences early in the day and then carry them throughout the entire day, when nowadays you can get a positive text message that says, okay, it wasn't so bad, or something like that. But I do think, as is probably becoming apparent, about these channels of communication are either boons or disruptions to our positive psychology. I mean, it's clear that we're just like being bombarded all the time. So just as a practical question, what is your relationship to your phone? Do you set boundaries around your phone use, or the types of communications and activities that you engage with on your phone?
I do. So everyone, I think everyone I know has a to-do list. I also have a to-don't list. And on my to-don't list includes I don't scroll on social media, and I don't pick up my phone past 9 p.m. And those two habits are enormously helpful, particularly the not scrolling. I pick up my phone when I have something to post, or when I want to see what the comments are and then see if there's something interesting to learn or somebody that I want to respond to. And that becomes a really healthy boundary, because I don't get stuck in one of these rabbit holes where all of a sudden 2 hours have gone by and I feel like I wasted my time.
Where do you post or keep your to-do and your to-don't list? Do you keep them on your phone?
No, it's a Word document on my computer.
Okay. So you're still at the computer screen quite a bit each day?
Yeah.
Okay.
I feel like that's where most of my good thinking and writing happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I carry a small notebook around with me now and write things down. I was just curious.
Like one of these?
Yeah, well, like one of those. Yeah.
Yeah, I try not to take notes on my phone ever.
Right. Yeah, it can be problematic for me, especially with voice recognition now, because it's hard to go back to that in a systematic way for me. But I'm a big believer in these things but for those listening and not watching, I'm holding up a pen. So it's like pencils work too.
You've probably read some of the research also showing that you have a better memory for information when you take notes by hand than by keyboard.
I didn't know that, but I'm very, very gratified to hear that. So and I suppose if you don't have a pen and you don't have a pencil handy, then blood always works. Just kidding. I'm just kidding. Don't make yourself or anyone else bleed just to get an idea down. But it is amazing how sometimes we will have ideas while running, walking, showering, out and about, and then later try and recall those ideas. And if we don't write them down, they're gone. The great Joe Strummer from The Clash talked about the critical importance of carrying around a small notebook, such as you did, because he said that the ideas fall down like rain, and if you catch them, they're there. But if you miss them, they truly won't be there later. Yeah. And there's something kind of eerie about that. Like, why wouldn't we be able to remember these potential gems of ideas? All right, the geysering up of the mind. We had a guest on this podcast for a series, Dr. Paul Conti, psychiatrist, and he talked extensively about the unconscious mind. I mentioned this a little earlier, but one of the things that really stuck with me is he said, everyone thinks that the prefrontal cortex and the frontal cortex is the supercomputer of the human brain. Sets context, planning, strategy, switching, et cetera, et cetera. Certainly it's valuable real estate to our intellect and all our abilities. But he said, the real supercomputer is the unconscious mind. However, that unconscious mind that lives below the surface of our awareness is also what drives a lot of our unconscious defenses. So our so-called blind spots. So projection, projective identification, these can be both good or bad. They can serve us well or poorly. And so on and so forth. But implied in this notion of the unconscious and blind spots is that we can't become aware of things unless we either do dedicated work to become aware of them, or even better would be dedicated work where we are asking other people to say, hey, listen, you have a blind spot, and it is blank, blank, and blank. So tell us about the role of blind spots, maybe even some positive aspects of having blind spots, but more importantly, what we can do to fill in those blind spots and perhaps also explain how they can limit us. And if you have any examples that from the research where people overcoming their blind spots has benefited them, that would be amazing.
Yeah. Wow. There's a lot there. Let me start by saying I think a lot of people think about blind spots in terms of heuristics and biases. So you think about confirmation bias. You think about the classic Kahneman-Tversky work that ended up winning Danny a Nobel Prize on the way in which our intuitive judgments often get anchored in the way we've done things before, or we focus on the information that's salient and available to us and overlook less obvious information. I've come to think that the mother of all biases is what I think of as the I'm not biased bias. It's technically called the bias blind spot in Emily Pronin and colleagues' research, but the idea is that I think I'm more objective than other people. And you may have flaws in your thinking, Andrew, but me, I see things clearly and rationally. And I think that it's a really dangerous meta bias, because the moment you believe you're not biased, you are incapable of seeing any of your biases. So in some of the research on the bias blind spot, you see that people who score high in cognitive ability tests, so high IQ, are actually more likely to fall victim to the I'm not biased bias, because they've been reinforced for a lifetime that they're really smart and they're good at thinking. Oh
goodness, this explains some. We don't talk about current events on this podcast much, but this explains some current events. People that were told their entire careers that they are perfect or near perfect, and circumstances eventually came to slam them hard into the concrete on that one.
Or in some cases, it hasn't happened yet, but we watch them hurtling toward Earth. So I worry a lot about that. So I think the beginning of seeing any blind spot is recognizing that we all have blind spots. It's part of being human. I think that the brighter side of that is that we're not just blind to weaknesses, we're also blind to our strengths. So Jane Dutton and Laura Morgan Roberts and colleagues did some research on the reflected best self-portrait. This is one of my favorite exercises to do in the classroom, but also to do in workplaces. Sometimes even people end up doing it with their kids at home. The idea is that you do have strengths that you're not that aware of. They may be things that come naturally to you that you don't even realize are hard for other people. They may be things that are struggles for you. And so you think it's hard to do and therefore I'm bad at it, but other people watch you do it and realize you're actually quite good at it. So you need other people to hold up a mirror to see what these invisible strengths are. So the way the reflected best self exercise works is you're asked to contact 10 to 20 people who know you well in different walks of life. Might be a family member, a couple friends, some colleagues, and then you ask them to tell a story about a time when you were at your best. And you collect these stories. It's the most exciting week of email you will ever get. 20 notes, let me tell you how great you are. But what's key, this goes back to our discussion of feedback earlier, is they're really specific about a moment when you were at your best. And then your job is to collect all the stories and do the pattern recognition exercise and ask, what are the common themes that I've seen through these stories? And it's a really powerful and vivid way of getting a sense of what are those strengths. And it's not surprising that in some of the research, when people go through this process, they end up with much more clarity, not only about what they're good at and where their potential lies, but also what do those situations have in common where I was able to use my strengths, and how do I get myself in those situations more often? How do I create those situations more often? I'll give you a personal example on this. So I got a bunch of feedback that I was good at helping other people see their strengths. And I thought, okay, I don't feel like I have enough opportunities to use that strength in my daily life. So what am I going to do about this? And I ended up flipping the exercise upside down. And I picked 100 people who really mattered to me. And I wrote a story to each of them about a time when they were at their best. And I'm like, there's no reason I can't make this part of my day. It was probably one of the best weeks of my life. It was better than getting the stories, was giving them. And I got these notes back from people saying, I didn't realize, I don't even remember that thing that happened. But I think for me, it was an example of saying, okay, I've always enjoyed trying to bring out the best in others. I don't feel like, at the time I was a first year doctoral student, I didn't feel like I had anything to contribute to others. So I'm trying to learn how to, understand this field and, do a worthwhile study and write a paper. I'm not teaching yet. I have no value to add. And getting this feedback, like, oh, you're somebody who helps other people see their potential. I'm like, all right, let me take some people that I already recognize really amazing things in, and let me just tell them that. And it took me about a week to write the 100 emails, and I can't think of a week I've spent better.
Wow. It's so interesting that you flipped the process on its head a bit, or a lot, and that ended up being the reward. Do you think you learned anything about, given that it was early in your academic career, do you think you learned anything about your particular talent or desire to do what you do now? I mean, so much of what you described, it seems to map well to what you do now. I mean, you could be, if you were to choose or have chosen, but a laboratory scientist doing experiments. You're clearly still doing that with tremendous productivity, but you've also decided to tell the world about the information that you're gathering and the work of a lot of other people as well. I guess I feel a kinship here because we both do this.
It's much more interesting to cite other people's work than talk about what you already know.
It is indeed, and it's fun to be able to weave one's understanding of the process into what are other people doing and know how hard it is to do really good experiments and be able to spot really good experiments. But did you learn in that early stage of your career that I think I want to do this later? Because what you do now it maps pretty well onto what you just described.
I don't think it was. It wasn't crystallized at the time, but it was definitely one of those seeds that was planted that must have grown, because I remember right after I got tenure, a wonderful colleague of mine asked if I would write a book with him, and I was so flattered. And I went in to talk to my undergrad research lab later that day, and I mentioned offhand, I was like, hey, and I got this invite, I'm going to write this book, and they freaked out. Like, no, you cannot write somebody else's book. You have to write about your ideas first. Like, if you're going to write a book, write your own book. And I was very resistant because I love other people's ideas. I was like, no, I feel like what I do best. I think it was Boyer who wrote about the scholarship of discovery versus the scholarship of integration. And I never felt like I was a eureka, blindingly, original insight person. I felt like what I was good at was synthesizing ideas, and kind of taking a bunch of pieces of cloth and sewing them into a quilt and allowing people to see the big picture in a way they hadn't before. And I felt like I could do that with a colleague who was already a successful author. And my students basically held me hostage, and they said, "You've been doing this research for over a decade now, and you have a responsibility to share that outside your classroom." And it reminded me of that experience of saying, okay, there's something I see in other people. I want to share it with them. And maybe I could do that on a broader scale. So yeah, I think there were definitely dots that connected there.
When I was a master's student at Berkeley, there was a guy who's now moved to Michigan State, Mark Breedlove, who I hope to host on the podcast. Actually, does really interesting work on the biology of sexual differentiation. And
Mark, I think that's an invite if you're listening.
Yeah, right. And he, it is indeed. And he said to me, review articles, provided they are written by people who are credentialed in a given field, are cited at 100x any one particular paper. Now, at the time, I wasn't interested in impact factors. In fact, I've never paid any attention to impact factors. Their importance varies in different countries, and in the U.S. they play some role, more so in Europe. But I could care less about impact factor, frankly, because those metrics aren't what's going to carry you through the difficulty of designing and carrying out a hard experiment. You have to be intrinsically curious about the answer, right? You know this, and I know this. But he basically said something that really supports your point, which is that ultimately the ability to synthesize information can feel really good. And he started talking about the feeling that he got from doing that. He's also a tremendous bench scientist as well. In any event, I'm so glad that you flipped that exercise on its head, because now the world gets to benefit from you doing that for us all the time, because I realize now that much of what you do is to help people identify and erase their blind spots by, and I love your social media channels, and I noted on Instagram, and I do scroll, but I scroll through and to your channel too. You'll put up in short form content that really highlights the key importance of people embarking on strategies that they wouldn't reflexively take. That I see that over and over again. It's like we think that the best leaders do blank, but actually the research says they do exactly the opposite. And you have a vast kit of those. So along those lines, what are some of the most common blind spots that you observe and that people could benefit from understanding and doing contrary action around as it relates to let's say interpersonal relations in the workplace or at home, and maybe we could seed this with a finding that you've also written about, which is that people who have and exert a lot of proficiency and even control in their professional life will sometimes bring that to their relationship life, and that doesn't work, right? The idea that like being in charge and being confident is a great set of attributes. But it can really fail us in other domains. Can we weave that in with blind spots?
Yeah, we can. So I think that, one of the things I found over the past few years is that, and this was inspired by a Phil Tetlock framework, a lot of us spend a lot of our time thinking like preachers, prosecutors, or politicians.
Preachers, prosecutors, politicians. Okay.
Yeah, so you can think about these as three mental modes that even if you've never worked in any of these careers, you will watch your thinking colored by at least one of them more often than you would like. Mm-hmm. So in preacher mode, you're basically proselytizing your own views. Andrew, you're in some situations, I think of you as a highly effective professional debunker of preachers of certain kinds of snake oil when it comes to health and biology. Sometimes you take that too far, and people might accuse you of being a prosecutor, where you're attacking other people's views. And then the third mode, politician mode, is basically you don't even bother to listen to people unless they already agree with your views. What I think is interesting is these modes of thinking are adaptive in certain roles. So preachers make great salespeople. They're often visionary leaders. Prosecutors are often highly effective scientists, right? We excel at criticizing other people's work and finding what's wrong with it. Politicians are great at currying favor. They do a lot of lobbying. They win approval. The problem is that all of these modes stop you from questioning your own assumptions and beliefs. So I'll tell you, my biggest vice is prosecutor mode. I've been called a logic bully. My wife had to explain to me that was not a compliment.
Oh my goodness!
I know you've experienced this too. If I feel confident that there's strong evidence that somebody is wrong, I believe it's my moral responsibility to correct them, and that never goes well.
Amazing. I won't reflect on my own experience. I'll just say yes and yes. Right. The logic word ninja mode is one that I think we're trained in as academics.
We are.
And or if you're a lawyer or many other professions as well. And I think it holds value and it can be very effective in certain domains, but less effective in other domains.
Yes, and I think part of the problem is, whether you're preaching, prosecuting, or politicking, you look like you're not open because you've already, in all cases, you think you're right and other people are wrong. And so that makes it really hard for other people to reason with you, to disagree thoughtfully with you. So my favorite alternative, and this is at the heart of what you do for a living and for fun, is thinking like a scientist. And when I say thinking like a scientist, I do not mean that you need to buy a microscope or invest in a telescope. What I mean is, as you model so effectively, a good scientist has the humility to know what they don't know and the curiosity to constantly seek out new knowledge. There have been multiple experiments showing that when people are taught to think like scientists, their judgment improves, and so do their decisions. And I think a lot of that stems from when you go into scientist mode, you realize that all of your opinions are just hypotheses waiting to be tested. All of your decisions are experiments. And so you're like, well, I'm not trying to prove that I'm right. I'm trying to find out if I might be wrong. And then if I find out I am wrong, it's easier to pivot. And instead of being really invested in being right, I can try to get it right. And I think in some ways that's the meta message that I'm trying to communicate to people with my work is assumptions are meant to be pressure tested. They're meant to be questioned and challenged. And if you're not open to rethinking your views, then you basically turn thinking into a religion. And I don't know about you, but I prefer to base my views on good data as opposed to blind faith. And I think that's been a huge part of your contribution in the last 3 or so years to public discourse is you've helped people think more scientifically and talk more scientifically about their daily habits and behaviors. And I guess my big question is, how do we help people do that more often, even in domains where they don't have